For colleges and universities, delivering vital student services effectively and efficiently is as challenging as ever. QLess offers an effortless way for your students to access the services they need without standing in long lines. Students join a virtual queue using your campus website, their mobile phone, or an on-site kiosk. Timely updates and notifications alert students as they move to the front of the queue. Request a personalized demo for your campus today.
Hello and good morning, and thank you for joining us for this webinar. Today we're going to be talking about AB 540 and the California DREAM Act application. So first of all, what is the California DREAM Act application? And what is AB 540? So the California DREAM Act application, which is commonly referred to as CADA, is an application that allows undocumented and non-resident students to apply for financial aid in the state of California. And when they apply with the CADA, or the California DREAM Act application, that application is then administered by the California Student Aid Commission. That is to say, it's proprietary to the Student Aid Commission. And once we receive that application, we then process it so that those students are given consideration for the aid that they're able to receive, such as Cal Grants. Now, before we go any further, I think we should point out that we want to make sure we understand that our undocumented students in the state of California really come from many, many different countries. Obviously, and you can see on the chart here, that the majority come from Mexico or Central America, but we have students from all over the world. And the reason we point this out is that we don't want to make any assumptions about a student's status based on where that student is from. We have students from Europe, we have students from Asia, we have students from Africa, and they're all undocumented students who would benefit by filling out the California DREAM Act application. So, what requirements does a student need to meet in order to apply? Well, anyone can apply, but in order to apply and receive aid under AB 540, there are some certain requirements that the student has to meet. And when we talk about AB 540, some of you may not know what that is, but AB 540 is really a series of laws and legislation that have kind of gotten us to where we are today and allow undocumented students to receive financial aid if they meet the parameters or the guidelines of AB 540. Now, one other thing, sometimes students, because of their status, they're not sure if they should fill out the DREAM Act application or not. So if they're unsure, but they think they probably should, have them start with the DREAM Act application. There's some skip logic in the beginning of the application that will help the student navigate and determine whether or not that's the best application for them. Now, one thing we should point out before we continue is that applications this year are down. In other words, applications for the 21-22 academic year are down as opposed to the applications last year received by the same date. And you'll notice they're down significantly. So obviously COVID-19 has a great deal to do with this, and just the uncertainty that students have about whether or not they can go to college, whether they should put off college, as well as some of the political issues that have caused students to be fearful or their families to be fearful about filling out any kind of application. So it's important that we let students know that in the state of California, we want them to pursue an education. We have an application that's for them, and we certainly want to try to get those numbers up. So let's talk about AB 540. Like I said, AB 540 are just the requirements that you need to meet in order to use this application to get aid. So we have a couple of different options. Up until very recently, we really only had option A, which meant that a student had been in a California high school for 3 years or had at least 3 years of high school credit. That means that even if they hadn't physically been in a high school for 3 years, but they had 3 years of high school credit, they could make up the difference by having attended an elementary school or a middle school, and it doesn't have to be in consecutive years. Sometimes students come in and out of the state. Option B expands the parameters for eligibility. And option B basically states that you don't necessarily have to have graduated from a California high school, and you don't necessarily have to have the full 3 years in a California high school. You can, through a combination of attendance at other institutions, make up the difference and go to an adult school or a community college, the community college for up to 2 years to make up the difference, and then potentially be eligible for AB 540. Now, the other component of AB 540 is you do have to either graduate from a California high school or have taken one of the equivalency exams, most commonly the GED, or because of this new legislation, if you earn an associate's degree from a community college, you could also meet the requirements. Or if you meet the minimum requirements to transfer to a CSU or UC, you could also meet AB 540 requirements. You also need to remember that if a student gets a Cal grant and via AB 540 and the California DREAM Act application, they have to sign a non-resident tuition exemption waiver or paper. Sometimes we call it an AB 540 affidavit, and that stays with the college or university. We'll talk more about that in just 1 second. Now, a lot of times you get questions about visas and different kinds of visas. Generally speaking, only the temporary protected status or the U visa will allow students to complete the California DREAM Act application or the CADA. Many times students will have, there's all different kinds of non-immigrant visas. So if a student is here on a visa to study, or if someone is here on a travel visa or a tourist visa, most of the time, they're not going to be eligible to complete an application because they don't meet the requirements. Now, the exception for the California DREAM Act application, like I said, is if someone is from a country that currently has TPS or temporary protected status, or they hold a U visa. If a student has a T visa, they should file the FAFSA. So what exactly is temporary protected status? Temporary protected status is a designation that the United States gives to countries when those countries have things happening that make it difficult or impossible for the resident of that country to return. In other words, if you're in the United States and you're from Sudan, you don't have to necessarily return to Sudan because of negative things that are happening in that country. And that could be anything: armed conflict, natural disaster. Sometimes you have civil war. Sometimes there's just something happening in that country that does not allow a person to safely return to that country. In that case, we give it TPS status, and that would allow students in this case, if they're from these countries, and I've listed the current countries that have TPS status, if they are from a country that is TPS, they could fill out the DREAM Act application. Now, just bear in mind one thing: these countries can change. In other words, a country could fall off or be removed from the list, and a country could be added to the list. So students will need to check that status. Well, let's talk about Daca for just a second. Daca is great, and we're going to wait and see ultimately what happens with Daca. But what you need to know, and the most important takeaway here, is that Daca is not a requirement for financial aid. In other words, if a student has Daca or they don't have Daca, or they had Daca previously but don't have it now, it doesn't matter. It doesn't impact their ability to complete the California DREAM Act application. So Daca status and the ability to meet AB 540 and fill out the California DREAM Act application are two different things. And it can be confusing because, let's face it, Daca and the DREAM Act application serves kind of the same cohort, the same group of people. So knowing that, sometimes students and their families get confused that they're interrelated somehow, or that you have to have Daca to apply for financial aid, and that's not the case. I mentioned this AB 540 affidavit previously. So here's a couple things you need to remember, particularly if you work at a college. If you work at a college or university, you need to know that students do not know what an AB 540 affidavit is. They have no idea what it is or how they have to complete it or when they have to complete it or what the process actually is. So we do rely very heavily on the colleges and universities to contact these students and say, here's another part of the process that you need to complete. So undocumented students who are eligible for non-resident tuition, in other words, someone's filled out the California DREAM Act application, they're AB 540 eligible, they receive a Cal grant, then they need to complete this affidavit, and the affidavit stays at the college. Now, it's really, as we know, it's just something that's rubber stamped and kept at the college. But the most important thing to remember is that there has to be really good coordination and communication between admissions, financial aid, and the student, because students, frankly, don't know what this is. And if they are not made aware of the fact that they need to do it, obviously that can be impactful when it's time to get their financial aid. All right, so here's the California DREAM Act application. Now, you may have noticed that the DREAM Act application itself has undergone some changes. So it has received a little bit of a facelift. This is what we're hoping it looks like when it's all said and done. And the other thing that's really important to know is that the DREAM Act application is going to have a lot of internal changes as well. Most of you are probably aware of the fact that the FAFSA is going to change. And once the FAFSA changes, the DREAM Act application will change as well. Now, we don't know exactly when that's going to happen. If you're signed up for our listserv for email communications from CSAC, we'll send you more information about that. But that's the thing that you kind of need to remember is that, hey, this application is going to change and it's going to continue to change and be restructured. So we talked about who could apply. There's some additional requirements. So you have to be able to fill out that affidavit. And remember that your male students between 18 and 25 have to register for selective service. We have a recommendation for you. If you work with undocumented students, we highly recommend that you print out a hard copy of the California DREAM Act application. Why? Because it's a really useful tool and it makes for easy reference if you're helping a student either on the phone or online, during a Zoom call, during a virtual financial aid night or Cash for College. When the student says, I don't understand this series of questions, you can flip to that quite easily if the student's not able to share their screen, and then you have that information at hand. And it has a lot of good information as well. The helps and hints, for example, are printed at the end. So it's just very useful and it's a really good resource, and we highly recommend that you print it out and you have it handy. You may want to do the same thing with the FAFSA. When you have both of the applications, then it makes it easy to use as a reference. So the current California DREAM Act application mirrors and will continue to mirror the FAFSA in a lot of different ways. When you go into the DREAM Act application, you'll notice, for example, that it has tabbed sections. And just like the FAFSA, typically the student and or their family will go section by section to complete the application. So this application shows academic year 2021. The application year is going to be whatever year the student is applying for, obviously. College seniors, high school seniors who are planning to go to college will now be filling out the 2021-22 application. It's really important, that in the demographic area, in other words, in the student section, where it first asks you to fill out your name and your basic information, that students get this right. If they get their name wrong or if they get their date of birth wrong, that's not an easy fix. Is it fixable? Yes, but it will be time consuming and a little bit of a hassle if we're being honest. So you want to make sure that students are getting this information correct. If you're working with students in any kind of outreach and you're helping them with this application, make sure you say, hey, is your name correct? Is your date of birth correct? And all the other demographic information, for example, your address and your email, etc. And speaking of email, you want to make sure that students are using an email that they have access to. Now, sometimes students will use a high school email or a district email, and we don't recommend that they do that because sooner or later, that district email is not going to be available to them. We also don't recommend that they use a family email. Sometimes families will have one email that everyone can use. The Smith email family, okay. You don't want that either because there's going to be some really specific timely information coming, and we want to make sure the student is able to access that and answer that information. So you may want to create an email very specific to both this application process and when you apply to college. So some of the questions are confusing to students. Your citizenship status, remember, if you're filling out the DREAM Act application, you're going to be not a citizen or eligible non-citizen. So you want to make sure that students are clicking or selecting non-citizen or eligible non-citizen. That's going to be the correct answer when they're filling out this section about their citizenship status. The other parts that can be confusing are their status when they finish high school, and the questions about what degree or if they'll have a degree and what their grade level will be. So obviously, if you're a high school senior, you want to say that you will have a high school diploma. Maybe you're taking the GED. In that case, you'll indicate that. But you want to make sure that they understand that they're going to say that I'm going to have my high school diploma. I don't have a bachelor's degree yet. I haven't attended college yet, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And here's where those other questions come into play. Will you have your first bachelor's degree before you begin, your first academic year at college? No, I'm a high school student. I'm going to have a high school diploma and that's it. What will your grade level be when you begin the college in 21, 22, for example, or whatever year the student is starting? Never attended college first year. Even if the student took some, let's say, community college coursework, maybe they were duly enrolled, they're still going to select never attended college first year. And then finally, what college degree or certificate will you be working on? Just have them default to bachelor degree. When in doubt, have them put bachelor degree. Well, I might get my associates first and then, no, put bachelor degree. That's easier. Now, the only exception to this would be if a student says, I'm not interested in a degree, I want to go for vocational or technical or occupational training. I want to do a one-year course so I can get a certificate that allows me to work. In that case, that's what they would indicate. But when in doubt, have them default to first bachelor degree. Just like the FAFSA, students can list up to 10 colleges that they want to attend. We tell students it doesn't matter in which order the colleges are listed. You just want to list every single college that you are potentially interested in attending. And we recommend that if students are unsure about where they want to go to school, that they list one college from each segment. In other words, put a community college and a CSU and a UC and maybe a private university as well. Why would you want to do that? Well, because that way you get an idea of the financial aid that could be available to you at the different segments. So it's just something that gives a student an idea of what financial aid might be available at a CSU as opposed to a community college, at a UC as opposed to a CSU, at a private school. They can check and see. Now, it doesn't matter, like I said, what order they list the schools. The system will default to whatever school is listed first. Students can easily change that information, but it will default to that one. If they want to list more than 10 colleges, they can, list 10, let this application process, go back in a week later or a couple weeks later, take off the ones that they previously listed, and then add up to 10 more. And they could do this really as many times as they want to if they have a number of schools that they're interested in attending. The dependency section will determine if the student, for financial aid purposes, is dependent or independent. So most of the time, your high school seniors are going to be answering no to all these questions, and that will make them dependent students, right? If they answer yes to one of these questions, well, there's a good chance that they're going to be considered independent. The other section that's confusing sometimes is the number of family members. So in some cases, that's easy. Maybe you have a mother, a father, and 3 children. Well, the size of the family is 5. That makes life easy. But maybe grandma lives with the family supports grandma doesn't pay rent, mom and dad basically take care of and financially support grandma, which should be a member of the household. Yeah, if the head of household is providing 50% or more support, then technically she would be a member of the household, right? In the corresponding time period. So this can be confusing for students, but that's basically how it works. Now, one thing about families who fill out the California DREAM Act application, and this is also absolutely true of the FAFSA, sometimes they have very convoluted financial situations. And just like on the FAFSA, sometimes parents are going to indicate that they're not going to file taxes. Now, remember, we're talking about taxes from 2 years ago because we're working on prior year. In other words, 2 years ago, we look at the taxes as a snapshot for this upcoming academic year at the college. If a family indicates they're not going to file, they can certainly do that if they're not going to file. The only thing you need to be careful of is even if they don't file taxes, they have to indicate earnings or income. And if that number that they indicate is over the IRS filing threshold, then that's going to flag the application and mean that it may not allow that application to process. So if a family says we're not going to file, but hey, we made $1 million, that application is going to be flagged because the application is basically going to indicate or think, wait a minute, you didn't file taxes, but you made an amount of money over the filing threshold. So something has to give here. A common mistake, both for the parents and for the student, but typically more for the parents, is when they're filling out this particular section. Question 89 says, basically, how much money did you make? And you can tell this is an older form because it has a 1040A and the 1040EZ, and those aren't around anymore. We just have basically the 1040. But regardless, they indicated that they made $62,000. And then on question 90, it's asking, what was your tax liability? How much did you have to pay in taxes? And we put the same thing. Why? Because a lot of times parents or students don't understand this question. Basically what the family is saying here is, hey, we made $62,000, but whoops, we had $62,000 in taxes that we had to pay. Obviously, that's not true. And that would not be a good year for the family financially. So when a student tells me there's something going on in this parent section, this is one of the first places I look because it's a very common typical error. What if a student's parents lives in another country? Even if a parent lives in another country, they're still required to provide income and assets. And this is assuming that the student is in contact with that parent. If there's no contact between the student and the parent or parents, then does that mean they can list grandma's financial information or their aunts or their boyfriends or the family that they're living with? No, it doesn't mean that. Unless they've been legally adopted, they still need to list the biological parent's information. When that's not possible, then they have to contact the college that they'll be attending to have their situation evaluated as a special circumstance. And the college will then ask for additional information, typically, as most of you know, and they may be able to do what's called a professional judgment once they look at the information and possibly get some additional documentation. Signing the DREAM Act application is easy, especially for the student. When they get to the end, they just click the box and then they submit. Not save, submit. If they only save it, it won't process. So they actually have to submit it. They can save it at any time. Once they do that, the next thing that will happen is that parents will have the opportunity to sign electronically. Unlike the FAFSA with the FSA ID, the DREAM Act application is still relatively easy to sign. The parents would then just click a box and get a PIN number, and they could sign either immediately following the student's signature, or they could log back in and sign at a later time. After signing, if there's any problems with the application, student might get a little pop-up that says, hey, you've got some things going on that you need to fix. Typically, those sections will be highlighted in red. You can see each of the individual tabs. That would mean the student needs to go in and make those corrections and then resubmit the application. Remember, every time a dependent student resubmits the application, a parent needs to re-sign electronically as well. Finally, they'll get a Cadet confirmation page. The confirmation page may list things that need to be resolved. Now, some of these things are part of the default. In other words, if it's a male student, it will remind them to register for selective service. Not necessarily something they did wrong in the application, but just a reminder. Other things are things that they actually have to fix, like, hey, your parents still have to sign, or hey, there's a problem in this section, it's not complete. You'll also notice that it shows the next steps that the student should consider. So contacting CSAC if they have a question, logging back into the account to double check that it's complete, creating a Web Grants for Students account, etc. Selective service is really important. Remember, male students who are between the years of 17 years old and 3 months or older can, up to obviously 26, can fill out this form and mail it. If you're a FAFSA filer and you're a male, you can simply check a box and you'll automatically be registered for selective service. Unfortunately, we don't have the ability currently to do that on the California DREAM Act application. That means that your male students have to print out this form, fill out this form, and mail it in the mail with a stamp. And if they need to do this, they need to do it really early because it can literally take months for this to process. Now, right now, students are getting a little bit of a pass on the verification process if they can't demonstrate that they've done selective service, but that's going to change at some point. So you want to recommend to any high school student that you're working with, hey, make sure you complete the selective service form, mail it in as soon as possible, make a note of the date that you mailed it, maybe make a photocopy or an extra copy of what you sent in, and and then wait for what you get back in the mail from selective service. So High schools and high school districts upload GPA information for all of their seniors electronically. That's the law for public schools and public charters. And, you know, the vast majority of high schools throughout the state of California do that. And then students' information will be uploaded once they complete the CADA or the FAFSA, either application. And so what happens with that GPA is when that information is uploaded and then the application information is uploaded, the system will try to match up the GPA upload with the actual application. Most of the time when that information doesn't match, it's because of the name. In fact, 98% of the time, it's because the name doesn't match from one to the other. So if you're helping students in this process, remind them, use the name on whatever legal documents you have. So you want to make sure that if you have a California ID or a student ID or a birth certificate, you know, whatever your full legal name is, that's the name that you want to use when you're filling things out so that it will match. Now, it could be that you put your name correctly on the application, but the school doesn't have your name exactly the same way. Everything is fixable. It can be fixed. It just might slow down the process a little bit. There's a lot of reasons that students will have errors when they're filling out the application. So it could be that they filled out the incorrect application, that they filed after the deadline, that a mandatory question wasn't answered, or that it wasn't signed by a parent. This is a big one on the CADA. Now, this is just a reminder. I know we're talking about the California DREAM Act application, but if you have a student fill out the FAFSA and their parents are unable to create the FSA ID, they need to mail in that paper signature page. So we do have a lot of families who have sort of mixed status. And even though the student may not be a CADA filer, the parents still, because they don't have socials, would have to fill out that paper signature page and mail it in. So there's a lot of reasons. If a student comes to you and says, I haven't received an email, I don't know what's going on with my application, the best advice you can give them is to log back into the CADA and check to make sure that there aren't any errors, that everything that's mandatory is complete, that it's been signed by the parent or re-signed by the parent if the student has made updates. If the student makes a mistake on their name or their date of birth, there's a form that has to be submitted to the California Student Aid Commission in order for us to change it. And the student will have to provide documentation, corresponding documentation, in order for us to make that change. That's why it's so important that they get it right the first time, then they don't have to deal with using this form. But if they do make a mistake, we can fix it. And, you know, common mistakes, same thing with FAFSA filers. The middle name becomes the first last name, or maybe it's hyphenated in one place, but it shouldn't be hyphenated. It could be anything, all kinds of crazy things with the name. Same thing with the date of birth. And sometimes, let's face it, students just make mistakes. Hard to believe, but it's true. If the student fills out the wrong application or a duplicate application, or they fill out, for example, a CADA for the wrong application year, maybe a high school senior just filled out an application for 2021. Whoops, it should have been 21-22, right? In any of those cases, the student would have to use this G55 form for us to correct it. The other time that we use this form, maybe a student correctly fills out the CADA because when they filled it out, that was the application that corresponded to their status. But then they became either a permanent resident or a United States citizen. Obviously, their status has changed. They can now fill out the FAFSA. You would have to contact us as well in this situation and use this G55 form so we can convert that over to ensure that the student continued to get paid and became eligible for federal aid. Okay, so I talked about the fact that we have made some cosmetic changes to the CADA application. If you've used the application over the last 2 or 3 years, you can see some of those changes. But frankly, they are just cosmetic. And the image that I showed you previously, yeah, that's what we think ultimately it's going to look like, and that may change as well. But we will be doing some, under the hood changes, right? So it's not just going to be a new coat of paint, but we're going to work on the engine and the transmission as well. And here's some of the anticipated changes that we're going to make. So, one of the things is that we won't have pages where you have to scroll and scroll and scroll. We're going to eliminate those and make those shorter. When a student jumps from one section to the other, it will save. It'll become accessible with different browsers and with a phone or a tablet. And the other thing that I think will be really helpful is that the password, the sign-on portal, will be exactly the same for web grants for students and CADA. In other words, we're not going to have to reinvent the wheel and have the student make an entirely new application for their web grants for students with a new login and a new password and all that other stuff. It's going to use the same information. When these changes happen, we will let you know. They're being worked on as we speak, so we're hopeful that we can get these done as soon as we possibly can. Okay, let's go on with some CADA best practices. Now, this is specifically for colleges, so there's a couple different ways that you can find your DREAM Act applicants or your DREAM Act AB 540 students, and I'll talk about that in a second. So one of the best practices is something we talked to previously. Make sure that there's good contact between the financial aid office and admissions and records, and that you have all the information you need, and that the student is aware if they need to submit additional documentation or if they've been selected for verification, that they're made aware of that and they're submitting everything that they potentially need. We suggest that your staff is thoroughly trained on AB 540 eligibility. Anyone who's assisting that group of students, including if you have student assistants, they should at least know the basics so they can answer some basic questions about AB 540. Make sure that your financial aid management system can code AB 540 students appropriately. You want to be able to, in your system, to find those students. And then update AB 540 verification policies and procedures as needed. When the laws change or get updated in the state, your school policy should be updated as well to mirror that. So when there's a change that we make because at the state level, something's been implemented, you at your level also need to make those corresponding changes in whatever policy and procedure manual you have as it relates to Cal Grants and AB 540. You could search for students using the California DREAM Act Icers search. That's a tool. You can search by first name, last name. If you have the California DREAM Act number, which is the pseudo SSN, that makes life easy. But if you just have first name, last name, you can search. If you have date of birth, you can search. Bear in mind that if it's a very common last name, so for example, Jose Garcia, very common name, you're going to have lots and lots and lots of them populate up when you do that search. So you're going to have to maybe dig to find your student. The other thing you notice on this screen is that some of these applications have been successfully submitted, and we're now able to jump in and see the correct screen or the confirmation view screen or the Calstar report. Others we see, like the first couple, don't look like they've been successfully submitted, or they were hung up somehow. And it could be because it could be any number of reasons, but it doesn't look like they were submitted. The submit flag, the Y is not checked. So there's probably something going on with those applications. Now, if you want to find California DREAM Act Icers, there's a couple different ways you can do that. One way is to simply go and look at the report. There is a California DREAM Act Icer report that you can get via web grants. If you go into the web grant system and you click on portal menu, data transfer, report download, and then you use your drop down, you can find the California DREAM Act Icers, and you can look at it by academic year, and you can retrieve that file. Now, once you get that file, you may want to import that into your financial management system. Sometimes schools will, import it into just an Excel spreadsheet that they can manipulate the data or keep track of things. But this is one way to find that group of students. So the Calstar report simply is a report that shows you all of the information that was submitted or supplied by the student on the application. It's handy. Sometimes even the students will print it out if they, well, when they can physically go to the college and if there's a question about how they filled something out. So you can also go in and look and see how many transactions there are for each student, because every time a student goes in and makes a change, there's going to be a new transaction. And so you might say, wow, this student has 7 or 8 or 9 transactions. Maybe there's an issue going on here. And you can go in and find that information easily just by going into the Calstar report. Remember that CADA applicants, those who fill out the California DREAM Act application, 20% are randomly selected for verification. It's a standard verification process that you've used in the past, and you're going to go through and make sure that they meet the requirements for AB 540. You're going to make sure that if there's an income asset question, that if the students need to get an ITIN and file, that might be one of the parts of the things of the verification. Hey, your income over, you didn't file taxes or your family didn't file taxes, but your income indicates that you should have. You might have to get an I-10 and actually file to meet the requirements. Whatever the procedure is, you're going to go through and do that verification. Once that verification is complete, we're going to show you how you can indicate that. But obviously, you're not going to disperse funds until the verification process is complete. Now, when you get to the final page of the correction screen, there's some things that you can do. So for example, if you're a system administrator, you can indicate that there's a dependency override for this particular student. If you're going to submit a G21 and there's a professional judgment, or I should say there was a G21 that was submitted and the school determined that a professional judgment was needed, you can indicate that here as well. If the student is one of the 20% selected for verification, this is where you would come to check and indicate that that verification is now complete, at least one of the places. So you would check the corresponding box and submit this. And this is, again, the CADA correction screen, the very last page of that correction screen area. Okay, let's leave you with some updates and some resources. We have a California Dreamer Service Incentive Grant, which is coming. It's coming. And it's going to roll out sometime for the 21-22 academic year. We're not exactly sure when. This program was impacted by COVID and by the resulting changes in the California state budget. But the program is a go, and it's just a question of when it will actually start. And it may or may not evolve into something slightly different than what we're showing here. But basically, if a dreamer has completed a DREAM Act application and they're a Cal Grant B recipient, right, and they're attending a California public or independent institution, they have the ability to make money by doing either community service or volunteer service. So they can get up to $3,000 per year. The program is maxed out at 2,500 active students at any given time. And they have to, they can do up to 100 hours per quarter or 150 hours per semester, and they can be paid. Now, some people say, well, this kind of replaces the work study program for FAFSA filers. It does and it doesn't, but it does give these students, or it will give these students, an alternative way to make some money. And for those students who are already doing this kind of volunteer work or community service, now they can actually get paid for it. There will be a list of places they can volunteer when they fill out the application or the information. So, and most of those we're hoping will be on campus activities that they can perform. So again, we're waiting to see exactly what this looks like when it becomes finalized. if you're signed up for our emails from the California Student Aid Commission, you will hear as soon as we hear. And that's another good incentive for you to sign up for those emails. All right. The California Dream Loan Program, this is a few years old now. One of the things that's changed is that you can now use it for both an undergraduate and a graduate degree. So the basic criteria hasn't changed. You have to attend a CSU or a UC. You have to fill out the DREAM Act application, and you have to meet the other criteria. But you could be eligible for up to $4,000 a year or up to a maximum of $20,000 over the course of your post-secondary career, right? So, and you can also use it for professional or graduate degree programs, which is relatively new. If you want more information about this, you can contact CSAC. I will say this program is fantastic. That money can be a real bridge for those students who need that extra few $1,000s to go to school. It's still, we feel like it's still underfunded. In other words, schools go through these loans and the dollar amount that they have on hand very quickly. So unfortunately, it's not as available as we would like it to be, but certainly for those students who get it, it's very helpful. We are committed to working very closely with Dreamer Resource Centers. We want to continue to improve our communication with Dreamer Resource Centers. We have on our listserv, on our emails, we now have a section of information that's specifically for Dreamer Resource Center as laws change and programs roll out or there are program changes. And our goal is to work hand in hand with these resource centers to provide whatever we can provide to assist in terms of training or webinars or any kind of virtual event, anything that we can do to help and to be a part of events that they're holding. We do this all the time. So if your Dreamer Resource Center, maybe they're doing an event for their outreach specialists, maybe they're doing something for families. Many times the California Student Aid Commission can work with them as well and help participate in that event. Engage with us on social media. Yeah, we're all over the place on social media. And I can honestly say that we're actually doing a pretty good job with our social media. In the past, maybe that wasn't 100% true, but in the more recent future and more currently, we've been doing a much better job. So check us out on your favorite social media platform and you'll see interesting and engaging and updated information about what's happening at the California Student Aid Commission and what's happening with Cal Grants. We highly recommend the information that's available on immigrantsrising.org. This is an organization that does all kinds of fantastic work with our undocumented students all throughout the state of California. They have a resource binder, which I think the electronic version is free, and you can pay for the hard copy one if you want. But if you want a really good resource, we recommend Immigrants Rising. Now, certainly they are not the only organization in the state of California that offers these kinds of services. There are many other organizations that works with this particular cohort, but we just wanted to point out one, and Immigrants Rising is a good one. Here are some of the websites that we talked about previously. So the California Student Aid Commission is at the first one. If you want to go directly to the DREAM Act application, you can use that second link right there. And if you want students to be able to complete their web grants for students, after they've completed the CADA, they wait a few days and then they should go in and complete the web grants for students so they have access to all the information about their state aid, and they have a portal to look at everything about their Cal Grant if they have a Cal Grant. If you have further questions, you can certainly contact us. You can contact us on our school support numbers. Feel free to contact us at any time if you have questions. Here's the corresponding email and the corresponding phone number. You can contact us during business hours. So at this point, we just would like to say thank you. We certainly appreciate you taking the time to be a part of this webinar. We hope that you found the information helpful. Obviously, if you have questions or specific information about students that you need help with, you can contact school support, and we're more than happy to help you. Have a great rest of your day. And again, once again, we appreciate you being on today. Thank you.
Inceptia is committed to innovative, effective, and uncomplicated verification solutions for financial aid offices. Verification Gateway transforms the verification process for students, parents, and staff. Our virtual platform saves you time by increasing completed verifications and packaging rates. This means you can spend less time on the verification process and more time where it counts, with your students. Find out what Verification Gateway can do for you.